Rome stands as one of history's most accomplished imperial powers. Over the centuries, what began as a modest settlement on the Tiber River in central Italy expanded into a massive empire. At its height, Rome controlled territories that included England, the entirety of continental Europe west of the Rhine and south of the Danube, much of Western Asia, up to the Euphrates River, North Africa, and the Mediterranean islands, in contrast to the Greeks, who were renowned for their intellectual and artistic contributions. Rome distinguished itself through its formidable military, robust political system, and effective social structures. During the Republican era, Roman society was deeply rooted in military values, which helps explain the frequency of its wars. However, constant warfare alone doesn't fully explain Rome's imperial success. Unlike the Greek city-states that largely excluded outsiders from political life, Rome adopted a different strategy. From early on, Rome integrated conquered peoples into its political and social framework. Those who embraced Roman customs and loyalties were often rewarded with citizenship. During the period of the Principate, even seats in the Senate and the imperial office itself were sometimes held by individuals from provinces outside of Italy. The enduring impact of Roman rule is still visible today in the spread of Romance. Languages such as Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, all of which evolved from Latin. Modern Western civilization continues to use the Roman alphabet and a calendar derived from Roman. Innovations dot by the time Italy entered recorded history around 700 BC. It was already home to various groups speaking different languages and following distinct cultures. Most inhabitants lived in rural villages or small towns, practicing agriculture or raising livestock. The name Italia itself means land of calves. The people primarily spoke Italic dialects from the Indo-European language. Family. Among these were Oscan and Umbrian, spoken in the Apennine region. Latin, the language of the Latins in the Latium Plain, and Venetic, spoken in northeastern Italy, were closely related. On the southeastern coast lived the Apulians, also called Eopiges, and the Messapians, whose language bore similarities to that of the Illyrians across the Adriatic Sea. In the 5th century BC, Gallic tribes crossed the Alps and settled in the Po Valley Cisalpine Gaul, bringing with them a Celtic language. The Etruscans, on the other hand, were the first to establish a sophisticated civilization in Italy. Notably, they spoke a language unrelated to the Indo-European family. By 700 BC, Greek colonies had also been founded along Italy's southern coast, and both Greeks and Phoenicians engaged in trade with the local populations. Contemporary historians increasingly recognize that Rome's early development unfolded in a richly diverse cultural landscape, heavily influenced by the advanced civilizations of the Etruscans in the north and the Greeks in the south. Roman religion and rituals borrowed much from Etruscan traditions. Even the Roman alphabet was adopted from the Etruscans, who had in turn taken it from the Greek colonies. Many aspects of Roman political and ceremonial life were inspired by Etruscan customs, such as the curule chair, the purple-edged toga, praetexta, the bundle of rods known as fasces, and the practices of gladiatorial games and triumphal parades. Rome itself was situated about 12 miles inland from the sea on the Tiber River, a strategic position on the border between Latium and Etruria. This location offered a natural river crossing and sat along a land route from the Apennines to the coast, making it a crossroads for Latins, Etruscans, and Sabines. Although culturally Latin, the early Roman population was likely ethnically diverse. This diversity may help explain the Roman state's relatively inclusive approach to citizenship and integration in later historical periods. The regal period, 753 to 509 BC, and the early years of the Republic, 509 to 280 BC, represent some of the least documented phases in Roman history. This lack of detail stems from the fact that written histories of Rome did not emerge until centuries later. Greek historians only began to pay real attention to Rome during the Pyrrhic War to 82 to 75 BC, a time when Rome was finalizing its control over Italy and fighting the Greek city of Tarentum in the south. Rome's earliest native historian, the senator Quintus Fabius Pictor, wrote even later, during the Second Punic War, to 18201 BC. Thus, by the time Romans began recording their own history, they had already completed their conquest of the Italian peninsula. established themselves as a dominant power in the ancient world, and were locked in a major conflict with Carthage over control of the western Mediterranean. Fabius Pictor's account started with the city's legendary Trojan origins and traced events up to his own era, setting a precedent for future Roman historians. Over the final 2 centuries BC, at least 16 other Roman writers produced similarly comprehensive histories. These collective efforts are now known as the Roman annalistic tradition, as many of them attempted to organize Rome's story on a year-by-year basis during the Republic. Although none of these early accounts survive in full, portions of Livy's work, one of Rome's most prominent historians, have endured. The first 10 books of his history recount events from Rome's legendary beginnings up to 293 BC. Additional surviving books 21 through 45 describe events between 218 and 167 BC. Livy wrote during the reign of Emperor Augustus, 27 BC AD, 14, roughly 2 centuries after Fabius Pictor, who himself lived long after many of the events he described, though Greek historians did not begin writing seriously about Rome until the Pyrrhic War. They had been aware of its existence long before. In keeping with their tradition of explaining foreign peoples through myths involving their own, legendary heroes such as Jason Heracles or Odysseus, Greek writers from as early as the 5th century BC created at least 25 different origin stories for Rome. One of the earliest and most influential versions came from Hellanicus of Lesbos, who claimed that Aeneas, a Trojan hero, had fled the fall of Troy with a group of followers. After years of wandering across the Mediterranean, they eventually settled in central Italy, mingled with the local inhabitants, and became known as the Latins. Despite the lack of historical accuracy in linking Rome to Troy, later Romans embraced this noble ancestry. The myth became a central part of Roman folklore and identity. Roman historians were confident that the Republic had started around 500 BC, based on records of annual magistrates dating back to that time. Before the Republic, it was believed that Rome had been ruled by 7 kings in succession. By using genealogical methods borrowed from the Greeks, they estimated that these kings reigned for roughly 250 years, placing the beginning of the monarchy in the mid-8th century BC. Ancient writers disagreed on the exact founding date of Rome, with estimates ranging from 814 BC, according to Timaeus, to 728 BC, suggested by Cincius Alimentus. By the end of the Republic, however, the year 753 BC was widely accepted as the date of Rome's founding, with 509 BC marking the beginning of the Republic. To preserve the link between Rome and the fall of Troy, dated by tradition to 1184 B, historians invented a fictional royal lineage. According to their accounts, a line of kings descended from Aeneas ruled the city of Alba Longa for the 431 years between Troy's fall and Rome's founding. The last of this dynasty were the twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who established Rome on the Palatine Hill. Legend held that the twins, said to be sons of the god Mars, were abandoned in a basket on the Tiber River by the king of Alba. Miraculously, they were rescued and suckled by a she-wolf, survived, and eventually overthrew the tyrant king. While founding Rome, the brothers fell into conflict, and Romulus killed Remus. This tale reflects a recurring theme found throughout ancient Mediterranean mythology, where great leaders often have mysterious or miraculous births and childhoods. Variations of the story appear in the legends of figures like Sargon of Akkad, the biblical Moses, Cyrus the Great of Persia, Oedipus of Thebes, and the Greek twins, Neleus and Peleus. When writing about the earliest phases of Roman history, ancient historians faced significant challenges in uncovering the truth. They had access to an official list of yearly magistrates dating from the start of the Republic, known as the Consular Fasti, which provided the basic chronological framework. In addition, religious documents and some preserved laws and treaties offered a minimal outline of key events. To build a more complete narrative, ancient writers supplemented this limited factual record with a mixture of Roman and Greek legends. As a result, over time, the historical record of early Rome became increasingly distorted, shaped by patriotic embellishments, the omission of inconvenient facts, and outright invention. Evidence from the animistic tradition indicates that Roman histories from the 2nd century BC were mostly concise summaries of known facts and stories. However, By the 1st century BC, Roman authors had become deeply influenced by Greek rhetorical training, leading to much longer and more elaborate historical works. These writings included fictional speeches and extended descriptions of battles and political struggles that, while often inaccurate in their portrayal of early Rome, reflected the political climate and concerns of the late Republic. Livy's account of early Rome, for instance, contains a mixture of historical facts and imaginative storytelling, because the line between fact and fiction is often blurred in his writing. Modern historians frequently disagree about specific aspects of Rome's early history and, likely always will. The legendary figure, Romulus, regarded as Rome's first king, was a later invention. His name, unlike genuine Latin names, was likely created to explain the origin of the city's name. His supposed reign was filled with heroic acts befitting a mythical founder and son of the god of war. He was credited with establishing Rome's early political and social institutions, forming its military, and waging war against nearby communities. Romulus was also said to have briefly shared power with a Sabine named Titus Tatius, whose name may represent a real early leader. However, so little was remembered about him that his reign was merged with Romulus's in historical tradition, while the names of the remaining 6 kings were remembered by Romans. Detailed and accurate information about their rule was mostly lacking. Nevertheless, because later Romans sought explanations for long-standing customs and institutions, historians attributed various reforms and events to these early kings, often relying on stereotypes or flawed assumptions. The 3 monarchs who succeeded Romulus are known mainly by name, but the last 3 were recorded with more substance, and parts of their reigns may be supported by archaeological findings. According to tradition, Romulus was followed by the Sabine king, Numa Pompilius, whose rule was marked by peace and religious development. Numa was credited with creating nearly all of Rome's early religious institutions and rites. His pious character likely originated from a mistaken connection between his name and the Latin word numen, meaning divine will or presence. After Numa came Tullus Hostilius, whose reign was described as warlike, likely because later interpreters connected his name with hostility. Tullus was succeeded by Ancus Marcius, believed to be Numa's grandson, whose rule was portrayed as a combination of both religious and military initiatives. Archaeological evidence for Rome's earliest history is limited and uneven, primarily because many potential excavation sites are now occupied by later structures. The remains that have been found are often unclear and difficult to match with ancient literary sources. Nevertheless, archaeology can sometimes confirm or challenge the written accounts. For example, it supports the idea that Rome began as a simple village of thatched huts on the Palatine Hill, one of the 7 hills that made up early Rome, but it places this settlement in the 10th or 9th century BC, not the mid-century as tradition claimed. This means that Rome could not have been ruled by just 7 kings from its founding until the end of the 6th century. BC. Archaeological findings also reveal that the Esquiline Hill was settled before the Querinal Hill, contradicting ancient sources that claimed the opposite sequence of development between approximately 670 and 660 BC. The settlement on the Palatine Hill began to expand into the low-lying area that would later become the Forum Romanum. This marked the emergence of a town inhabited by craftsmen who lived in houses built on stone foundations. Material remains from this period revealed the presence of trade and the growing influence of both Etruscan and Greek cultures. Excavations at other Latin sites from the same time suggest that Rome was still very much a typical Latin community. During a significant transformation throughout the 6th century BC, this Latin settlement evolved into a true city. The swampy valley that would become the Forum was drained and paved, turning it into a public center. Archaeological evidence shows extensive temple construction, and findings such as pottery and building materials demonstrate not only active trade with the Greeks and Etruscans but also local craftsmanship, shaped by their influence. This urban development is traditionally attributed to Rome's last 3 kings, Lucius Tarquinius, Priscus Tarquin the Elder, Servius, Tullius, and Lucius. Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. According to ancient accounts, the 2 Tarquins were father and son of Etruscan origin. while Servius Tullius was portrayed either as a native Latin or, in another version, as an Etruscan named Mastarna. All three were celebrated in Roman tradition as accomplished city planners and administrators. A characterization supported by archaeological discoveries, their supposed Etruscan background seems plausible given Rome's closeness to Etruria, its increasing strategic importance, and the kinds of large-scale public works these kings undertook, which mirror those seen in Etruscan cities of the same era. It appears likely that during the 6th century BC, some Etruscan adventurers took control of Rome and reshaped it into a city influenced heavily by Etruscan models. Ancient historians described Rome's first 6 kings as wise and benevolent, but the final monarch, Tarquinius Superbus, was cast as a ruthless tyrant. According to tradition, he murdered his predecessor, Servius Tullius, seized the throne unlawfully, and ruled with cruelty, suppressing the Senate and burdening the population with forced labor on public projects. His reign was framed in the narrative of a Greek-style tyranny used by later writers to explain Rome's transition from monarchy to republic, in line with Greek theories of political evolution from monarchy to tyranny to aristocracy. This framing offered the Romans a patriotic tale in which tyranny was replaced by liberty. The story goes that Tarquinius Superbus was overthrown after a public uprising triggered by the assault of a noblewoman named Lucretia by the king's son. Her tragic fate sparked widespread outrage and led to the fall of the monarchy. However, this tale is likely not historical and seems to be a Roman adaptation of a well-known Greek legend in which a love affair in Athens ended in the murder of a tyrant's brother and the collapse of his regime. According to Roman tradition, after expelling their final king, Rome was soon besieged by Lars Porsena, the king of the Etruscan city of Clusium. The city was said to have been heroically defended by figures like Horatius Cocles, who died protecting the bridge over the Tiber, and Mucius Scaevola, who tried to assassinate Porsena in his camp. When captured, he is said to have demonstrated his bravery by thrusting his right hand into a fire without flinching. Impressed by such courage, Porsena supposedly agreed to a peace settlement and withdrew his forces. One modern interpretation suggests that Rome's monarchy may have ended, not through a noble uprising, but as a result of military defeat and foreign interference. Rome's strategic location made it an attractive prize for the Etruscans, who during the 6th century BC were extending their influence southward across the Tiber and into regions like Campania. Near the end of the century, Rome may have lost a war against King Porsena, who then occupied the city and expelled Tarquin. However, before he could take the throne himself, Porsena was forced to retreat, possibly after suffering defeat at the hands of a coalition of other Latin communities and the Greeks of Cumae, rather than restoring Tarquin to power. The Romans chose to abandon monarchy altogether, replacing it with a new system in which 2 consuls were elected annually to serve as chief magistrates. As the Roman state expanded in both size and influence during the early Republic, 509–280 BC, it saw the emergence of new political offices and institutions, while older ones were modified to meet the evolving military, political, social, and economic demands of the time. According to the annalistic tradition, these developments were driven by a prolonged political conflict between 2 social classes, the patricians and the plebeians, which was believed to have begun in the early years of the Republic and lasted for over 2 centuries. Initially, the patricians were said to have held exclusive control over the most powerful institutions, including the consulship, the Senate, and all major religious offices. In contrast, the plebeians had little political standing apart from the right to vote in public assemblies. Over time, however, plebeians were believed to have gradually gained rights and political access through persistent agitation and resistance, eventually achieving legal parity with the patrician class. Ancient historians like Livy attributed Rome's entire early political evolution to this long-standing social conflict. Tradition claimed that the division between patricians and plebeians dated back to the very foundation of Rome and had supposedly been established by Romulus himself. Yet the historical reality of this distinction remains one of the most perplexing and unresolved issues in early Roman history. While the patrician-plebeian divide certainly existed in the Middle and Late Republic, modern scholars disagree on exactly when and how it originated. Many now believe that the divide developed gradually during the early Republic, rather than existing from the start. By the Middle and Late Republic, the distinction had lost much of its original significance. Only a small number of families, about a dozen, remained patrician. All others were considered plebeian. Both groups included members of the Roman nobility, which was defined simply as those descended from consuls. Thus, the term patrician should not be confused with noble. As patricians represented only a subset of the broader noble class, the only meaningful difference between the two in later periods was eligibility for certain minor offices, some reserved for patricians, others not. The inconsistencies, contradictions, and logical flaws in Livy's account suggest that the portrayal of a struggle of the orders oversimplifies what was in fact a complex and multifaceted process. Undoubtedly, tensions did exist. No state can go through 2 centuries of history without experiencing social and economic conflict. Legal records indicate that Rome's early laws on debt were particularly severe, likely causing significant hardship for many citizens. However, it is unrealistic to assume that all internal developments in early Rome stemmed from a single conflict between 2 social groups. The original documents, if any, had survived, likely recorded only that a certain office was created or a law passed, offering little insight into the motivations behind these changes. The deeper explanations were likely filled in by oral tradition or the historian's own imagination, neither of which can be considered reliable. Livy's depictions of political crises during the early Republic reflect the rhetoric and ideological battles of his own time. The late Republican should therefore be approached with skepticism. For instance, his discussions of agrarian reform in the early Republic are framed using the language of later periods. Similarly, he describes early tensions between plebeian tribunes and the Senate in terms that echo the late Republican conflicts between the populares and the optimates. Thus, while many of the institutional changes recorded by ancient writers may be factually accurate, the explanations they offer must be treated critically. The events themselves can often be accepted, but the traditional interpretations demand careful scrutiny. Later generations of Romans regarded the abolition of the monarchy and the introduction of the consulship as the formal start of the Republic. The religious duties once carried out by the king were transferred to a lifetime priestly office, known as the Rex Sacrorum, King of Sacred Rites. Meanwhile, the king's military authority imperium was granted to 2 officials elected annually, known as consuls. These consuls were always considered the highest-ranking officials of the Republic, and each year was named after the 2 individuals who held the office. Forming the foundation for chronological records and later historical accounts of the Republic, the consuls primarily served as military commanders, leading Rome's armies into battle. As such, they were chosen by the Centuriate Assembly, a voting body organized along military lines. Both consuls held equal authority, a concept known as collegiality, which applied to most Roman magistrates. This system acted as a safeguard against abuses of power, as one consul could veto or block the actions of the other. According to traditional accounts, the first plebeian consul was elected in 366 BC. Prior to that, all consuls were believed to have been patricians, and much of the so-called struggle of the orders centered on plebeians demanding access to the consulship. However, applying later classifications of patrician and plebeian family names to the list of consuls, from 509 to 445 BC, reveals that plebeians were already represented about 30%. This suggests that plebeians may never have been legally barred from holding the office. The distinction between patrician and plebeian families may not have become fixed until around the mid-4th century BC, and the legislation of 367 BC, which mandated that one of the 2 consuls must be plebeian, may have simply ensured that both branches of the elite shared in the Republic's highest office. While the principle of shared consulship generally worked well, times of military crisis sometimes called for unified leadership. Rome addressed this by creating the office of dictator, a temporary position that replaced the consuls during emergencies. According to tradition, this role was established in 501 BC and used periodically until the Second Punic War. A dictator held absolute command for a maximum of 6 months and was also referred to as Magister Populi, master of the people's army. He appointed a deputy, the Magister Equitum, master of horse, to command the cavalry. Importantly, this office was entirely constitutional and should not be confused with the later dictatorships of Sulla and Caesar, which effectively legalized personal rule gained through military dominance. It is possible that the Senate already existed during the monarchy, serving as an advisory council to the king. The name Senate itself derives from senes, meaning elders, suggesting its original members were older men valued for their experience and knowledge in a largely oral culture. In the Republican era, the Senate consisted of members from Rome's most prominent families. Its exact size during the early Republic is uncertain, though sources suggest it included around 300 members during the Middle Republic. These senators were known collectively as paters et conscripti, the fathers and the enrolled, implying that the Senate was initially made up of two distinct groups. Given that patrician stems from paters, it is likely that this distinction reflected early differences between patricians and plebeians. Throughout the Republic, the Senate advised both magistrates and the Roman people. While the people were theoretically sovereign and the Senate's role was only consultative, in practice it wielded substantial authority due to the collective prestige and experience of its members. The Senate was the Republic's most influential, deliberative body, convened by magistrates who presented issues for discussion. When a majority reached a decision, it was issued as a senatus consultum, or the Senate's advice. These resolutions were directed to magistrates or the people, and were usually either carried out directly by a magistrate or submitted for formal approval by the popular assemblies. During the Roman Republic, two main assemblies were responsible for electing magistrates, passing laws, and making key decisions. Participation in these assemblies was limited to adult male Roman citizens, who had to be physically present in Rome to vote. The voting system followed a group-based method. Although each individual cast a personal vote, the outcome was determined by the majority vote within a designated group. The collective vote of each group counted as a single unit, and a majority of these group votes was required to decide any measure. One of these assemblies was the Centuriate Assembly Comitia Centuriata, which had a military character and was divided into voting units known as centuries, originally based on military organization, because of its association with warfare. It convened outside the city's sacred boundary Pomerium, in the field of Mars Campus Martis. This assembly was responsible for decisions on war and peace, and it elected officials who held consuls, praetors, censors, and curule idus. Prior to the establishment of permanent criminal courts in the late Republic, it also functioned as a high court in capital cases. Although it possessed legislative authority, most legislation was typically handled by the tribal assembly. The Centuriate Assembly went through different phases in the early Republic, though we only have detailed information about its final structure. It likely began as the citizen army gathering under arms to choose commanders and vote on matters of war and peace. In historical periods, its organization became quite intricate. Citizens were divided into 5 classes based on wealth, with each class assigned a different number of centuries. In total, the assembly comprised 193 voting units. The wealthiest class, the first, held 80 centuries. The second through fourth classes each had 20. And the fifth class, the poorest eligible for military service, was given 30. Additionally, there were 18 centuries of knights, wealthy men able to serve in the cavalry, and 5 more centuries, including one made up of the proletary landless citizens, too poor to serve in the army. The knights voted with the first class, and voting proceeded in order from the richest to the poorest. Asterisk, because the knights and first class held a combined 98 centuries. They had the power to decide outcomes before lower classes even had a chance to vote. Although they made up a small segment of the population, their control over the majority of votes ensured that political dominance remained with the upper classes. The structure of the assembly was clearly intended to protect the influence and authority of Rome's traditional elite. The tribal assembly, Comitia Tributa, on the other hand, was a civilian, non-military body that met within the city limits. Inside the Pomerium, it elected officials who did not hold imperium, such as plebeian tribunes, plebeian aediles, and quaestors. This assembly carried out most of the lawmaking and acted as a court for serious public offenses involving fines. Compared to the Centuriate Assembly, the tribal assembly was more democratic in nature. It was organized by geographic divisions called tribes and voting was based on residency. Rome itself was divided into 4 urban tribes. In the 5th century BC, the surrounding rural areas were divided into 17 rustic tribes, as Roman control expanded through central Italy between 387 and 241 BC. 14 more rural tribes were added, bringing the total to 35. This number remained fixed. Thereafter, one of the most significant moments in the struggle of the orders was the establishment of the plebeian tribunate. In 494 BC, driven to desperation by continuous military service, worsening economic hardship, and oppressive debt laws, the plebeians withdrew from the city en masse and camped on the Sacred Mount, roughly 3 miles from Rome. There, they organized themselves and chose their own representatives to safeguard their interests. With an external threat looming and internal instability rising, the Senate had little choice but to recognize these new officials, the tribunes of the plebs, granting the plebeians formal representation within the Roman political system. At first, there were only 2 tribunes of the plebs, but their number grew to 5 in 471 BC and later to 10 in 457 BC. Unlike consuls, they had no official insignia, yet they were considered sacrosanct, meaning that anyone who physically harmed a tribune could be killed without legal consequence. They were granted the authority to intervene on behalf of citizens against the actions of a consul, although this power was limited to within 1 mile of the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome. Tribunes had the ability to summon the tribal assembly and propose laws for its consideration. They could also bring charges against other magistrates before the people for misconduct in office. Furthermore, they held the power to veto the actions of fellow tribunes, veto meaning I forbid. Assisting them were 2 plebeian aediles who helped manage the city's daily affairs. Although tribunes were viewed as protectors of the common people, many who held this position came from aristocratic backgrounds and typically supported the established order. Still, the role could be used as a platform by ambitious young nobles to gain popularity by backing causes that appealed to the masses, even when those causes opposed elite interests. Modern historians are divided over the reliability of the traditional account concerning the plebeians' first secession and the establishment of the plebeian tribunate. According to the ancient narrative, this was the first of 3 such secessions, with the other 2 supposedly occurring in 449 and 287 BC. The second is widely regarded as fictional, and many scholars believe the first was also a later invention, accepting only the final one as historically credible. Although the first secession is described in a way that mirrors the later agrarian crisis during the time of the Gracchi, some evidence suggests that genuine social and economic tensions, such as strict debt laws and food shortages, recorded around 492 and 488 BC, may have contributed to the creation of the office. Religious records from the period likely preserved these events. Interestingly, the civilian nature of the plebeian tribunate aligns well with the military character of the consulship, suggesting that the 2 offices may have originally been designed to complement each other in service to the state, rather than to oppose one another. The creation of the plebeian tribunate was followed by Rome's first formal codification of its laws. The plebeians were said to have demanded a written code to place limits on consular authority and prevent abuses. After years of pressure from the tribunes, the Senate conceded. A special commission of 10 men, the Decembrii, was appointed in 451 BC to draft the new laws. When they failed to complete their task within a year, a second commission was formed. However, this group became tyrannical and remained in power beyond their term. Public outrage eventually forced their removal, especially after one member's ruthless pursuit of an innocent girl named Virginia. His actions shocked the people and led to a second mass secession. The resulting law code was engraved on 12 bronze tablets and displayed publicly in the Roman Forum. It addressed a wide range of issues, including legal procedures, debt collection, paternal authority, property rights, inheritance, funeral practices, and various crimes, though many of its rules became outdated and were later revised. The Law of the 12 Tables became the foundation of Roman private law, because the code did not explicitly limit consular powers. The traditional explanation for its origin appears questionable. The story of the second oppressive group of 10 is thought to be modeled on the 30 tyrants of Athens, and the tale of Virginia closely resembles that of Lucretia and the fall of Rome's final king. This casts doubt on the historicity of the second secession, which is a central element in that narrative, given the available evidence. It remains uncertain whether the legal code was a response to social and economic pressures. It's also possible that as Rome expanded, a more structured legal system was simply needed to manage the city's growing complexity. The establishment of the office of military tribunes with consular authority in 445 BC is believed to have stemmed from the ongoing conflict between the social orders, according to traditional accounts. This development was a political compromise between the plebeian tribunes, who demanded access to the consulship and the Senate, which aimed to preserve patrician control of the office. From that point on, Roman citizens would vote each year to choose either to patrician consuls or military tribunes with consular powers, who could be drawn from either the patrician or plebeian class records. From 444 to 367 BC show that the chief magistracy alternated between consuls and military tribunes. Consuls continued to be chosen more often until 426 BC, after which military tribunes were more frequently elected. Initially, 3 military tribunes were appointed, but their number rose to 4 in 426 BC and then 2, 6 in 406 BC. The consular tribunate was ultimately abolished in 367 BC and replaced by the restored consulship. Livy reports that, according to some sources, the office of consular tribune was created in response to the demands of managing 3 simultaneous wars. Since there is no solid evidence that plebeians were legally barred from holding the consulship, some scholars argue that the introduction of the consular tribunate was driven by the expanding military and administrative needs of the Roman state. Other records support this interpretation. For example, in 447 BC, 2 quaestors were elected to manage financial matters on behalf of the consuls. Their number was increased to 4 in 421 BC, starting in 443 BC. 2 censors were elected approximately every 5 years to serve 18-month terms. They were responsible for maintaining official citizen roles, evaluating property, and assigning individuals to their appropriate tribes and centuries within the tribal and centuriate assemblies. The expansion in the number of military tribunes coincided with Rome's first significant conflicts, particularly those against Fidni and Vigi. In 366 BC, the 6 generalist military tribunes were replaced by 5 officials with distinct roles to consuls to lead military campaigns. 1. Urban praetor to handle legal cases in the city, and to curule aediles to oversee various civic responsibilities. By 362 BC, the annual election of 6 military tribunes to serve as subordinate officers under the consuls had become standard practice. The restablishment of the consulship in 367 BC was part of a package of 3 tribunation laws known as the Licentio-Sextian Rogations. One of these laws prohibited individuals from leasing more than 500 iugera, approximately 330 acres, of public land. Another addressed the issue of public and private debt. Although the second proposal has been questioned, Rome's substantial territorial gains following the conquest of Vigi make such a land law plausible. The detrilated law is also considered likely to be authentic, given that other evidence suggests debt was a pressing issue during the mid-4th century BC. 352 BC, a 5-man commission was created to offer public loans aimed at reducing private debt. A law passed in 342 BC, attributed to the tribune Genotius, temporarily suspended interest on loans. Later, in either 326 or 313 BC, the Poetelian law modified the harsh debt servitude conditions established by the 12 Tables by banning the practice of chaining debtors. Rome's economic development was marked by a shift from cumbersome bronze currency to silver coinage, modeled after that of southern Italy's Greek states. These Romano-Campanian didrachiums marked a significant step in Rome's monetary evolution. Although the exact date of this change is uncertain, estimates place it between the First Samnite War and the Pyrrhic War. By this point, Rome was rapidly transforming from a regional town into a dominant power across the Italian peninsula. Increasingly involved in the broader Mediterranean world, legal reforms around 300 BC reflect this expansion. Legal proceedings could only take place on designated days known as dies fasti, making knowledge of the calendar crucial. In earlier times, the Rex Sacram would proclaim the official calendar, allowed each month to the assembled populace while suitable for a small agrarian community. This method became inadequate as Rome grew and more citizens lived far from the city. In 304 BC, a curule aediile named Gnaeus Flavius defied conservative norms by publicly posting the calendar in the Roman Forum, for all to see, a move that greatly benefited the general public. Traditionally, Roman private law and legal procedures had been the domain of the pontifices, a priestly group. In 300 BC, the Augullian law, introduced by tribunes Gnaeus and Quintus Augullius, ended the patrician dominance of two major priestly colleges by expanding the number of pontifices from 4 to 8 and augurs from 4 to 9, mandating that the new positions be filled by plebeians in 287 BC. The third and possibly only historically accurate secession of the plebs took place. Livy's account of this event has been lost, so details are scarce. One explanation suggests that widespread debt triggered the unrest. Several sources agree that the crisis ended with the passage of the Hortensian Law, named after Quintus Hortensius, who served as dictator in 287 BC. This law was believed to have granted decisions made by the tribal assembly the same legal authority as those passed by the centuriate assembly. However, since similar claims are made about laws enacted in 449 and 339 BC, some scholars remain skeptical. It is possible that no real difference ever existed between the two assemblies in terms of legal power. These three laws may reflect later misinterpretations of a rule in the 12 Tables, which stated that the most recent decision by the people should be binding. Another tradition holds that the Hortensian Law made all assembly days available for legal matters. If debt was indeed a driving force behind the secession, the law may have been intended to speed up the resolution of lawsuits in the praetor's court in Rome. Although the Latin peoples lived in separate self-governing towns, their shared language and cultural traditions fostered collaboration in areas such as religion, legal practice, and warfare. All Latins were permitted to take part in the worship of common deities, including the Penates of Lavinium, Juno of Lanuvium, and Diana, whose cult was honored in both Aricia and Rome. Marriages between Latins posed no legal barriers, and when traveling to another Latin town, individuals could trade, bring legal actions, and even vote just as freely as locals. If a Latin chose to settle permanently in another Latin city, he would gain full citizenship in that new community. While conflicts between Latin states did occur on occasion, they would unite in the face of external threats, joining forces for mutual defense. Each member state contributed troops in proportion to its capabilities, and a single commander selected from among the Latin cities would lead the united force by collective agreement. The Latins also established colonies in hostile territories, using them as military outposts that evolved into independent Latin towns, each enjoying the same privileges as the rest. Modern historians refer to this network of shared obligations and rights as the Latin League. Ancient accounts claim that Rome's final three kings were responsible for turning the city into a true urban center and elevating it to a position of leadership within the Latin League. However, this portrayal is likely embellished. Roman writers often aim to present early Rome as a city destined for greatness, portraying it as more dominant than it likely was. Rome did become a significant player in Latium during the 6th century BCE, but other cities such as Tibur, Praeneste, and Tusculum were just as influential for quite some time. A treaty between Rome and Carthage, dating to 509 BCE, and preserved by the Greek historian Polybius, shows that the Romans, or possibly the Latins, more broadly laid claim to a stretch of coastline, about 70 miles south of the Tiber River, as their sphere of influence, one they expected the Carthaginians to respect. Rome's swift ascent in the 6th century was largely due to the dominance of its Etruscan rulers. When Etruscan influence collapsed in Campania and Latium around 500 BCE, Rome's fortunes waned as well. After the fall of the monarchy and the temporary conquest of Rome by Porsenna, followed by his defeat at the hands of the Latins and his eventual withdrawal, the Latium plain came under increasing threat from nearby highland tribes such as the Sabines, Aequians, and Volscians. These groups, facing population pressures, sought to seize new lands. Much of Rome's foreign activity during the 5th century thus centered on providing military support to the Latin League to fend off these invaders. Nevertheless, many aspects of Livy's narrative of these wars are considered unreliable. In seeking to craft a tale that would match the grandeur of Rome's later power, Livy and his sources depicted these early conflicts with inflated drama. The army's ranks, fortification methods, and battlefield strategies he describes actually reflect the military system of the late Republic rather than that of 5th century Rome. By the end of the 5th century BC, while Rome and its Latin allies were still resisting the Volscians and Aequians, Rome began expanding its territory at the expense of the Etruscan city-states. The Roman Republic's unending warfare and territorial growth have sparked modern debates about the character of Roman imperialism. Ancient Roman historians, many of whom were patriotic senators, portrayed all Roman wars as defensive and justified. Their writings reflect this belief, often omitting or altering events that didn't align with that narrative. The modern theory of defensive imperialism, built on this traditional view, has since been largely rejected. Only the conflicts of the 5th century BC and the later campaigns against the Gauls can reasonably be described in such terms. More often than not, Rome's steady expansion provoked neighboring peoples to retaliate in defense of their own territories. Roman consuls who commanded the legions frequently supported warfare as a means of gaining personal honor and political prestige. Likewise, the centuriate assembly, which had the authority to declare war or make peace, may have sometimes been motivated by the promise of wealth, expecting to benefit from captured land and loot. Although records from this period are limited, Rome's creation of 14 new rural tribes between 387 and 241 BC indicates that population growth may have been a significant factor driving expansion. Moreover, Roman settlers living near the frontier were likely eager to confront nearby groups such as the Gauls and Samnites, who posed recurring threats. The Samnites, in particular, practiced transhumant animal herding, moving their livestock seasonally between mountain and lowland pastures, often leading to disputes with settled Roman farmers. While Rome did not engage in warfare for religious reasons, it often invoked religious rituals to support its military actions. The facial priests played a ceremonial role in formally declaring war. According to their traditions, Rome could only enjoy divine favor when fighting in a just cause, typically defined as self-defense. In practice, this requirement was often met by manipulating opponents into declaring war first. Rome would then issue its own declaration, thereby maintaining the appearance of acting defensively. This strategy helped boost morale at home and occasionally improved Rome's image abroad. Rome's first significant war against an organized political entity occurred with the town of Fidna, located upstream from the city. The conflict, which lasted from 437 to 426 BC, ended with Rome annexing Fidna's territory. Next came a prolonged and difficult war against Veii, a prominent Etruscan city nearby. Later, Roman writers claimed this war lasted 10 years, from 406 to 396 BC, likely an intentional echo of the legendary Trojan War. After the fall of Via, its patron goddess, Queen Juno, was ritually invited to take up residence in Rome. The conquered territory was absorbed into Rome's domain, increasing its landholdings by 84% and resulting in the creation of 4 new rural tribes. During the campaigns against Fidna and Veii, Rome expanded the number of military tribunes, with consular authority, first from 3 to 4, then to 6. In 406 BC, soldiers began receiving pay for their service, and in 403 BC, the cavalry was enlarged. The victory over Via gave Rome access to southern Etruria, allowing for further conquests. In the years that followed, Rome established colonies in Nepet and Sutrium and compelled the towns of Philiori and Capenna to become allies. However, before Rome could build on these gains, a Gallic tribe descended from the Po Valley raided Etruria and marched on Rome. The Romans were decisively defeated at the Battle of the Allia River in 390 BC, after which the Gauls captured and plundered the city. They withdrew only after receiving a ransom in gold. This traumatic event left the Romans with a deep fear and respect for Gallic power. Later, Roman historians attempted to soften the blow to national pride by recounting heroic tales of commanders such as Marcus Manlius and Marcus Furius Camillus. Rome's power had suffered a major setback, and it took 4 decades of intense warfare across Latium and Etruria to fully recover. The second treaty between Rome and Carthage, signed in 348 BC, shows that Rome's sphere of influence remained largely unchanged from what it had been in 509 BC. However, Rome's dominance within Latium had grown considerably stronger in the 40 years following the second treaty with Carthage. Rome quickly rose to dominance in Italy, particularly in regions south of the Po Valley. A significant portion of the warfare during this time involved 3 major conflicts with the Samnites, a people who, at the outset, were not unified under a single political structure, but instead lived in independent Oscan-speaking tribes across the central and southern Apennine Mountains. Rome's growing influence likely contributed to the Samnites' decision to unite militarily in opposition to a shared threat. The mountainous terrain and the fierce resistance of the Samnite warriors posed serious obstacles, forcing Rome to adopt tactical reforms that later proved crucial in its broader conquests across the Mediterranean. The First Samnite War, though brief 343 to 341 BC, led to a major gain for Rome, the fertile region of Campania, with Capua as its capital. Roman writers modeled their account of the war's outbreak on the famous narrative by Thucydides describing the Peloponnesian War. Nonetheless, they were probably right in claiming that the Campanians engaged in a conflict with the Samnites over Capua, sought Rome's help by forming an alliance. If this is accurate, it would mark one of the earliest examples of a weaker power drawing Rome into conflict, only to later be absorbed by it once the enemy was defeated. In Campania's case, Rome secured control of the region, possibly granting it a form of Roman citizenship without voting rights, known as civitas sine suffragio. This acquisition significantly boosted Rome's military and economic strength. Rome's incorporation of Campania alarmed the Latins, who feared for their autonomy and chose to resist. Since the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC, Rome had gradually asserted more control over the Latin League. For instance, in 381 BC, the city of Tusculum was fully incorporated into Rome through citizenship. Later, in 358 BC, Rome established 2 new rural tribes in the Volscian coastal region. The Latin War, 340-338 BC, followed and ended quickly in Rome's favor. As a result, most of Latium received Roman citizenship and was added to Roman territory, though local governments were allowed to remain intact. Larger Latin cities, like Praeneste and Tibur, retained nominal independence by becoming allied military partners. The Latin League was formally dissolved, but the mutual legal privileges the Latins had previously enjoyed were preserved by Rome in the form of the Latin right, Jus Latici, which became a legal stepping stone for non-Romans on the path to full citizenship. With control over central Italy firmly in hand, Rome spent the following decade securing and advancing its frontiers through continued conquest and the establishment of colonies. This led to renewed conflict with the Samnites in the Liris, modern Liri River Valley, triggering the Second Samnite War, also called the Great Samnite War, 3-6-304 BC. In the early stages of the conflict, Rome suffered significant losses. However, in the latter half of the war, Rome managed to recover, restructure its forces, and ultimately claim victory. A major setback came in 321 BC, when a Roman force was ambushed and trapped in a narrow mountain pass at the Caudine Forks. Forced to surrender, Rome had to agree to a 5-year treaty. Later, Roman historians attempted to minimize this embarrassment by crafting tales of Rome rejecting the peace and ultimately avenging the defeat. In 315 BC, after hostilities resumed, Rome was again defeated, this time at La Chile. Historical accounts suggest that while Rome initially borrowed hoplite tactics from the Etruscans, suitable for flat terrain and used during the 6th and 5th centuries, BCIT eventually switched to the more adaptable, manipular system used by the Samnites, likely in response to their success during this period. This formation resembled a checkerboard layout, with units arranged in solid blocks separated by gaps, allowing greater flexibility in movement, particularly in rough terrain. The manipular system became a core part of Roman military organization, continuing well into the imperial era. During this same period, Rome began laying the foundations of a basic naval force, initiated the construction of its first military roads, with work on the Via Appia starting in 312 BC and the Via Valeria in 306 and expanded its annual military conscription. This increase is reflected in the rise of annually elected military tribunes, which grew from 6 to 16 between 334 and 295 BC. Rome established 13 colonies to counter the Samnites and added 6 new rural tribes from newly annexed lands. In the final years of this conflict, Roman influence also extended into northern Etruria and Umbria. Through a series of successful military campaigns, the cities in these regions were compelled to become Rome's allies. Ultimately, the Great Samnite War ended with a Roman victory. Around the same time, Rome also secured its third treaty with Carthage in 306 BC, under which Carthage recognized all of Italy as falling within Rome's sphere of influence. The Third Samnite War, to 98 to 90 BC, marked the Samnites' final effort to maintain their independence. In a last bid for resistance, they succeeded in rallying the Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls into a coalition. Rome faced this powerful alliance at the decisive Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC and emerged victorious. The remainder of the war was spent suppressing residual Samnite opposition. From that point onward, the Samnites were tied to Rome through a series of formal alliances.